we're going to turn this over to Tim Daly, who is the president of the New Teacher Project. He's going to be talking about their work with teacher observation and their work with states and districts. He'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have another Q&A session. And again, during the Q&A, feel free to unmute your phones when you ask your question. Tim, you on the line?
I'm here. Can everybody hear me okay?
I hope so. If not, if you're having any trouble with technology, feel free to hit the chat. And you also have an email address for Nina Cajotes, who is doing our tech support today. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to walk through a set of information that's going to be maybe a little bit different than what you hear from some other folks, because my focus is going to be on what we've learned rather than the predefined set of services that we offer. I just want to be upfront about why that is. So we typically partner with states or large urban districts to do custom designs of evaluation systems, and we don't really have a kind of package set of things that we do. So I wouldn't be able to say, we offer training that lasts this many hours, and this is how much it would cost, mostly because we tend to do things that are specific to some kind of local context. So if the presentation feels slightly different, that's okay. It's also okay if you want to interrupt me as I go along and ask clarifying questions. It doesn't bother me at all. I was a middle school teacher, so when my kids didn't interrupt me, it usually meant that they weren't paying attention to me. So interruptions to me have positive connotation. Here's how we got involved in this work in the first place. We wrote a report in 2009 called the Widget Effect that documented these issues with teacher evaluations, including that they are very infrequent, that they're unfocused, so that they tend to look at a lot of things, but they look at a lot of unimportant things as opposed to the things that matter most. They're undifferentiated, meaning that teachers really don't get specific messages about what they do well and don't do well from most evaluations. They're unhelpful in the sense that teachers don't believe that the process of going through evaluations makes them better teachers. It's something that at best they tolerate, and for the most part, that's what administrators say too. It's a part of their job that they tolerate doing, but they don't really like it, and they don't really think that it makes their schools better places. And they're inconsequential. So even in the rare instances when evaluations did turn up something significant and clear, that information was very rarely used for employment decisions. And I mean all types of employment decisions, to be clear. I don't just mean salary advancement or dismissal. I also mean things like most districts don't look at which teachers are getting the best evaluations and where they were trained and go back to those training sources and try and get more teachers from there, for instance. It's very uncommon for folks to do that. So the sum of it was not really a conclusion about evaluation, but rather a conclusion about the teaching profession, which is that we tend to treat teachers as interchangeable parts. And I think you'll agree with me that that's a far more troubling conclusion than just deciding that teacher evaluations aren't good, because it speaks to the very culture of our schools, that we don't have any idea where the instruction is meeting or exceeding our expectations, and where we should be really concerned about the quality of instruction. And we have no culture in American schools of doing that successfully. That problem has really transformed what we do as an organization. The way that it has been translated into the wider policy sphere has really been around evaluation. I just want to be clear that we don't now, nor do we ever think that evaluation is the sole issue here. Evaluation is just one symptom of a much deeper and much more challenging issue. And if we don't try to solve the wider issue, my guess is we won't solve evaluation either. But just trying to solve evaluation will get us not too far. So I will start with that. That's the first thing we've learned. We have entered into partnerships with a number of districts and states that you'll see on this map on slide 3. The states are colored in light blue. I hope that shows up for you okay on your monitor. And I will also point out that Rhode Island is small enough that it is covered up, so it would be colored in blue if you could see it over there on the East Coast. We also partner with a number of districts, including Houston, New Orleans, New York City, and New Haven. So in total, the jurisdictions in which we are involved in a significant partnership contain about 327,000 teachers. And we have played different roles in those places. There are a number of other localities in which we played a smaller role, but these have been places where we engaged in intensive design and implementation work. Oops, I think I went too far. The next thing that I would point out to you is that we have put out a number of publications that are available on our website that describe specific things, specific aspects of the evaluation issue that are freely available. You can take them, you can use them, you can alter them, do whatever you like with them. And I want to make sure that you know they're there, because we sometimes hear from folks, especially at the state level, that they're struggling to get information on some of these issues and they didn't realize that these resources are out there. One of them is called Teacher Evaluation 2.0. We put it out a year ago, and it outlines 6 design standards that new evaluation systems should meet. A lot of state committees use those when they're going through their design process. We printed 5,000 copies of it, and we quickly ran out of them, but you can still get it online. Secondly, we created an approach for rating observation tools. Observation is just one part of evaluation, obviously, but what we found is that people were struggling to distinguish tools that had a high likelihood of getting them good results from those that didn't. And also, many jurisdictions, both LEAs and SEAs, were engaging in custom design on their own, which is a pretty dangerous thing to do, because rubrics are sort of they hold together for a reason, and when we make changes here or there, sometimes the changes can have outcomes that we don't anticipate and don't want. I usually liken it to working on your own car or fixing your own television set. There are a handful of people out there that have that skill set and that can do that, but most people are like me. If something goes wrong with my car, my television, I need to take it to somebody else to work on. And our advice to most jurisdictions is you should not be creating teacher observation rubrics or altering them on your own. You should have people who have some expertise do that. But what's a better role is to be a consumer and to evaluate the options that you have and pick from among them. So that's what that document does. And then the third one was mostly geared towards states that were eligible for Race to the Top funding in the third round, the very small grants that are available to those that made the finals in the second round but didn't win. We made some suggestions for how they could prioritize their spending when if they chose to spend their Race to the Top money on evaluation. How could they do that in the way that would get would take them the furthest, given that they would certainly not be receiving enough money to do everything that they wanted. So those 3 things are all downloadable on our website, which is tntp.org. We've played a number of roles that I want to outline for you, and the main reason I want to go through these is that it is critically important that as you are setting up your strategy, that you think about all of these things, because there's not one part of what we've done that I would not say is critical. All of this stuff is really hard, and if you underinvest in any of these, you can run into trouble. So the first thing we've done is stakeholder facilitation. We sometimes have organized input from all sorts of stakeholders into design models. So for instance, in Houston, we ran a design process that included a committee at every single school. So over 400 different committees gave input. In New Haven, they did a district-wide approach, so we facilitated a labor management process that had only a couple of stakeholders. So we've done that a few different ways. Stakeholder engagement is very time-consuming and expensive. It often is necessary, though, for people to feel like the design process has been legitimate. So I can answer questions about that if you want to hear them, but that is something that is difficult to do. And particularly what we found is that SEAs and LEAs don't have sometimes the staff who can move things forward between meetings, and so decisions lag simply because there isn't anybody owning it to move things forward. The second thing is rubric design and modification. We have created some rubrics from scratch, and in other instances we have modified existing tools based on input from stakeholders and particular design challenges at the local level. So we now have a whole variety of tools that we had some hand in. We don't consider ourselves artists of the classroom observation rubric. We try to be more versatile, and I'll talk a bit about what we've learned, but what we've concluded is that simpler is better. Most of them are too complicated and too long, and what really matters is that people understand how to use them. You can get pretty good results out of a number of different approaches. The third thing is appraiser training. So in initial system rollout, we have provided the upfront norming and inter-rater reliability support. But more than that, we have taken the rollout all the way to the classroom level through co-observations that we do with school administrators and retraining. Most of that has been at the district level, but what I mean by appraiser training is not just let's certify you as having passed an initial test and then go forward and do good, but rather we don't believe someone has been trained and we verify that they're implementing the tool in their school with fidelity and success. Communications means explaining to folks what the new system is so they understand how it applies to them, whoever they are. It includes school leaders, it includes teachers, it certainly to some degree includes parents because parents want to know what these new things are. This is probably one of the number one areas, probably the number one or number two area that jurisdictions underinvest in. This is very hard to do to help people understand change and to help communicate a complicated process in a way that is informative and non-threatening, and something that I think we've learned a little bit about, but this is something that for sure I would urge folks to, whatever amount of attention you're dedicating to it, double it, because it's always going to take more. Data monitoring means that when the system is being implemented, the collection of real-time data, not summative data, which I would define as waiting until the end of the year and letting the results come in, but collecting data real-time that can be used to correct course. If you don't do this, I can't say this clearly enough, if you do not collect real-time data, it is not going to work because you will have outliers. You can't just expect that folks will be well-trained and then off they go and they will do this the way you want them to, because it is not part of the culture of schools to do that. So you'll get lucky sometimes. People will intend to do the right thing, and many times they will. But overall, if you don't have an ongoing data monitoring strategy, you're going to have big problems that go on for a while before you correct them. And then lastly, LEA and SEA capacity. That means creating the roles and responsibilities for agency staff to make sure that they can support this beyond initial installation. Many times you can rally everybody to be totally focused on the initial rollout because they drop everything else and put their eyes on this. That is good, but in an ongoing way, there have to be structures, offices, and people who make sure that this becomes a part of the work of schools and the work of teachers. And in most cases, there has never been a department of teacher effectiveness or of principal effectiveness. Oftentimes there's been an academic side of the house, and there's been an operational or back office side of a district or a state, but there's not been somebody who's in charge of the people that are in the schools and making sure that we are making great decisions about them. So in some cases we've helped districts and states make decisions about how they will organize themselves to support evaluation reform. I'll pause there for a second in case anybody needs to interject with a clarifying question.
Tim, can I ask you, this is Corinne, about the data monitoring? You mentioned that as a really important piece of it. Do you have any tools, or do you recommend how states or districts go about doing that, like collecting that data on an ongoing basis?
We have done it in different ways in different places, and so this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, and I apologize for that, but it really is the truth. The way to do it is any way that you have to. So in districts, we sometimes have built custom tools to store data in, and that involves some technology creation or procurement. In a really small district, you can get away with tracking on spreadsheets, and that's not going to be realistic for a state, clearly. What we learned, though, is that you don't have to collect this every single day, but what you can set up is a period or a set of kind of deadlines where maybe 4 times during the school year you have everybody turn in all their results. And what you'll get from that is verification that the observations for teachers are actually happening. You will also get a sense of what the distribution of ratings is. You can get that type of information on a statewide basis by surveying your districts and giving them some kind of an avenue to report their results so you can then crunch those numbers and decide where you have problems. So, for instance, you could ask the HR directors of your districts to log into a survey and say, how many teachers do you have in your district? What percent of those teachers do you have an evaluation on or an observation already this year? What percentage of teachers in your district are getting each of the following ratings, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't get a response, then you know you might have a problem. And if you see data that seem way off, and you will occasionally see that, where you know that this district has some mixed quality of instruction, but they're reporting results where every single one of their teachers is in a positive category, then you can target your time to follow up in the places where things are the most off. So that's what I would say. You don't necessarily need a really big, expensive, and cumbersome structure to do the basics.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to walk through some early conclusions that we have had in doing this work, and these are going to be as plain as I can put them. I will not show you a lot of data to support them, and partly that's because the data are not public yet. The people that we're working with, in some cases, are not ready to release it. In some cases, it will be released through official studies that will come out in a year or two. But we think it's important enough to talk about these things to give people a heads up. So the first one is that improved evaluations are likely to show that mediocre instruction is a lot more common than has been publicly acknowledged, and that many of the classrooms in your state will not have basic skills in evidence. Let me unpack that a little bit. What I mean is not that we have an enormous number of ineffective teachers, meaning teachers who should not be teaching tomorrow. They may be teaching today, but they're poor enough that we should not have them teaching tomorrow. I don't think that number is really high. I think it's probably in the ballpark of what most people suspect, which you'll get estimates from 5 to 10%. That's probably about right. But the percentage of teachers who are above that level, but who do not have the skills to make a real impact on student achievement, or whose skills are about approximate to a brand new teacher with no experience, the percentage of teachers in that category is a lot higher than you think. And what I mean by basic instructional skills are not in evidence is that if you build a rubric that is tough and honest, and you send people in and they implement that rubric, and they give tough and honest ratings, you are going to find in some cases that 30, 40, and 50% of the teachers in your state can't do things that you probably have assumed they can do. That means things like asking probing questions and looking for deeper understanding. You are going to find an enormous number of classrooms in which your teachers can't do that. And if you push them, you're going to find that it wasn't just that they had a bad day on the day they got observed. You'll find that they actually don't know how to do it. You will also find a lot of problems around things like being able to present material in multiple ways. There are a lot of teachers that have one speed. They can present their material one way, which is the habit of the way that they do it. And if all the kids don't get it, they really don't have a second pitch or a change-up that they can throw that alters the presentation for students who will get it the second way. Good teachers can do all the things that I just described consistently, and they can do them really without thinking too much about it. So what you should be ready for is a choice. One, you can call the instruction as it is, and you will have political fallout because people are not going to be happy about numbers that come out the way that these might come out. And I don't mean that teachers in their summative ratings will do poorly, but on many individual skills, they will be that way. Or we can choose not to call it like we see it, and we can inflate the ratings, and we'll be right back where we started. So what I'm flagging for you is you've got two choices that are not going to be fun, and I think one of them is better to choose, but it's still not going to be fun, which is let's confront the instructional problems that we have and work on getting better instead of pretending that we don't have problems. The second thing we've learned is that implementation depends on working with administrators really closely, because if we don't hold a high standard among administrators for instruction, they will inflate. A lot of folks tell me that they're concerned about inflation and deflation. They want accurate ratings. You should be a lot more concerned about inflation than deflation. Deflation will happen. It is very rare. It's going to happen in specific circumstances for specific reasons. Inflation will happen almost everywhere that you don't have good controls for inflation. And there's two reasons. One is that the past culture has been such that teachers were told forever that they were doing really well. And it is very, very hard for administrators to explain why they have been telling teachers they're doing a great job for 20 years, and now they've changed their mind. It just culturally is very hard to do. And adults, especially in schools, but this is true of adults in general, they have a hard time having those kinds of conversations with one another. The second reason you'll see inflation is that the administrators, when they lack the skill to diagnose issues and give very clear, targeted feedback, their default is to give a high rating so they don't have to give feedback. So when in doubt, when administrators don't feel secure, they will usually retreat to inflation. Those two forces are quite powerful, and they happen often enough that when you're not careful, you get a lot of inflation. The third thing we've learned is that incorporating evidence of student learning is very difficult work, but it can be done. However, the key thing is that we cannot pretend that professional judgment is not a part of measuring learning. What I mean is we cannot rely on tests to tell us how much student learning is happening, because tests don't translate. Tests give us scores for students, but we have to interpret those scores using some kind of judgment to determine whether or not we think enough growth has happened, even if we have tests. So you're going to have a test from last year and a test from this year. Sometimes because things have existed like value-added scores, where we put the information through an algorithm, we control for certain things, and it puts a number out on the other side, we assume that that has done all the work for us, and we don't have to interpret that number in any way to translate it into an assessment for the teacher. But we do. Even value-added scores, we have to decide what's good enough to get a high rating and what's low enough to get a poor rating. So professional judgment is a part of everything that we do, and it will certainly be a part of assessing teachers in untested grades and subjects. In electives, it will be a part of assessing teachers who teach early childhood, in special education, and the list goes on and on. So one of the things that is very important is to never talk about this process as if our goal is to reduce professional judgment and subjectivity to nothing and have only objectivity. Because in fact, professional judgment is a form of subjectivity, just hopefully a well-developed, judicious, and sharp form of subjectivity. So therefore, we want to make sure that we're not trying to obviate professional judgment, but to improve it. And when you're trying to improve professional judgment, we're going to be right back to working with the professionals in the schools to make sure that 9 out of 10 times, or 9.5 out of 10 times, they make the kinds of judgments that we hope they would make. If we can't get to that, then eventually I don't think we're going to improve instruction. I'll pause again in case folks have questions there about that slide. And I will say I'm going to get into it just a bit more detail with the remaining ones if you're hoping for a bit of elaboration.
Barbara has a question. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi. Okay, so my question relates to Scott's presentation and how his presentation kind of dovetails with this. And I know that his was talking about observations, classroom observations specifically, but I'm looking particularly at number 2 about this tendency to inflate, and he was talking about inter-rater reliability and the importance of that, and I'm wondering if this tendency is, despite all of what you do in terms of, he was talking also about scientific and looking for evidence, and you're talking about using judgment, and so I'm just trying to think about how this all kind of dovetails. So I'd like you to speak to that. And also, you mentioned something about 9.5 times out of 10 we want things to be, and he said that he was looking for, and maybe this is a different different measure altogether. I think he mentioned 80% integrator reliability. So if you could just talk about that.
I can do that. I'm going to talk a bit more about inter-rater reliability in just a moment.
Okay.
But let me. I'll address two things. One, I meant 9 or 9.5 times out of 10 that they are making all sorts of judgments the way we would want them to. I think that Scott was probably referencing the actual percentage of time that one rater's assessment would match another one. So there are many people who say aim for that 80% inter-rater reliability. What I would say is we should not get too falsely precise about the scientific nature of watching human beings do their work and rating it. You can get people, and I'll flip this slide. It'd probably be a little bit easier if I put this up. I'm going to go forward a little bit, and then I'm going to come back, Barbara, to help answer your question. But for folks who are on the phone, I just advanced to slide 8, which talks a bit about inter-rater reliability. So I would be careful about making too much of this. Inaccurate evaluations are going to undermine the credibility of the whole system. Absolutely, that is true. But at the same time, if we get obsessed with administrators rating teachers the same, I think that we're going to run into a couple of problems. The first one is the most likely scenario where you hit 80% inter-rater reliability is if everyone inflates. It's really easy to do if everyone gives 3s and 4s. When you are honest about it and you really differentiate performance, it's a lot harder. And that's because you do have a tendency to inflate. So sometimes the principal is going to want to say it's a 3. And an objective third-party master observer who comes in is going to say it's a 2. That's a real conflict because they didn't give the same rating. But the truth is they actually think the instruction is the same. The administrator is just reacting to the pressure to inflate. And therefore, we need to work with the administrator to make them more confident in giving that rating. It is not an issue of training because the administrator probably knows what the instruction is. They just can't bring themselves to communicate that rating, whereas the third-party person can. So when you think too much about inter-rater reliability, it will drive people to ignore some of the kind of translation of theory to practice things that are challenging.
This is Corinne. I think Scott is still on the phone. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that as well.
I won't take much. I won't take up Tim's time, but I totally agree with everything that Tim has said. The pressure to inflate is enormous, and especially when you're the local person who's got to live with these teachers on a day-to-day basis, and you want to minimize conflict, and you're hurrying and all of that. My push on collecting evidence is really a best practice approach during the observation itself. When you're collecting evidence in the classroom, I would say, from my perspective, the judgment comes in as you are in the conference with the teacher in the post-conference, and you're reflecting together on what happened in the classroom, and you, as the observer, have judgments. You share those with the teacher, and you have conversation about that. So it's in the summarizing and the goal setting and the next steps that the judgment takes place. It's the data collection process in the early part of the experience where you're just collecting classroom evidence that you have to be more unbiased and strict on the research process. So I think these two comments fit hand in glove, and I certainly think Tim's right on in terms of his perspective.
Yeah, and I think it sounds like I agree with Scott too about the judgment in the post-conference. I think that's exactly right. But there's another point about gathering evidence scientifically, which is a huge thing because sometimes people can arrive at a generally right rating for the wrong reasons because they're not really looking at the evidence, but they're being influenced by things like past practice. So even if we agree, we actually disagree about why. The second thing that comes up is that many differences in evaluator ratings are inconsequential because they don't affect the summative score. So I don't mean that they're not problematic, but I just think it's important for people to understand that if you have 10 competencies that you rate a teacher on, I may rate a teacher a 4 on this one and a 2 on the next one, and you may reverse those. You may rate them a 2 on this one and a 4 on the next competency, but when you average them all together, we arrive at the same point. So the teacher is going to get the same summative score, and they're going to end up in the same rating category, even though you and I disagreed on 100% of those 2 ratings. We got to the same place. So again, it's important to kind of prioritize issues in terms of what is really going to have a tangible impact on the outcomes that would undermine the credibility of the implementation. From the state level, it would be great if we could make everything up, but I think you all know you can't do that, so pick your battles. And third, even when we put a lot of resources into inter-rater reliability, I think that we found that at most schools we can do pretty well. The problem is that we always have outlier schools for local reasons that are kind of understandable. So for instance, we find that it sometimes happens in districts that schools with higher income kids who are higher performing, their principals don't believe that they can give bad ratings because the school is doing so well that it would be impossible to justify it. So sometimes they'll come back to us with universally high ratings, even though people who have seen the instruction in the school find it to be more mixed. We also find that sometimes when things like a principal is about to retire and they don't feel like they're going to be held to account because it's their last year, they don't want to leave on a bad note. They like their teachers. They think their teachers are great and hardworking. In some of those situations, it does not matter what you do. You're going to have some outliers. It's just there's a limit to how much we can control these things, at least at this point. So I wanted to put those things out there, mostly just to ground us that inter-rater reliability is something that we have to be aware of, but we can't be consumed by it because I think that it could lead us in some troublesome directions. Our suggestion is to think of it a little bit more like bullet 2, which is that you need to have a strike zone. And for people who are not baseball fans, there is an official strike zone that umpires are supposed to use, but everybody knows that some umpires are a little bit more lenient and some of them are a little bit more strict about where that zone is. The players realize that and they adjust to it. What people and fans are generally okay with it, but you have to be sort of within the limits. You can have little deviations, but you can't have big ones. And what they get really concerned about are when umpires are inconsistent or when they're wildly off. I would think of inter-rater reliability that way. If it's really off, we have a big problem. But it's possible to tolerate just a bit of variation and to mostly focus on finding the outliers and getting them back to the strike zone, which is going to take a fair amount of work. Barbara, did I answer your question, by the way? And it's okay. I apologize if you're on mute and you can't jump in. But if I didn't answer your question, will you please signal and direct me back to the parts I skipped?
No, you did answer. Thank you very much. You both did. Thanks.
Okay, great. The second thing I want to just spend a little bit of time on is appraiser training. Because we don't have the resources at the state level for sure to be present in every classroom. It's just not possible. Race to the Top doesn't have those resources and nobody else does either. So sometimes we think about the best thing that we can do is design the system and roll it out. And I think I understand that. But it's really important to understand that training is not just a one-time thing. There's a big investment in upfront training, and then you've got to continuously follow up, develop the evaluators, and coach them. Increasingly, we are thinking about the development as not installing the evaluation system, but fostering in our evaluators a sensibility about instruction that will allow them to not only assign good ratings, but have good follow-up conversations, direct teachers to the right kind of development, and make good decisions about when teachers are improving and should be continue to be supported, and when teachers aren't improving, and we need to make a change. Norming focused on video segments we have found is easier because it can be consistent and we can use them in a wide range of places, very scalable, but it does not translate all that well to the school environment because of the things I mentioned before around the pressure to inflate and the culture of schools. So what we have found is that if you have a choice between investing more resources up front in training to achieve a really good level of statewide consistency to show that everyone was normed at one point versus investing fewer resources up front and saving your money for ongoing retraining where there are problems, we would go with the latter. Because we assume there will be outliers and because we assume that there are going to be some troublesome places, and if you don't have any money left or any bandwidth or reach left to send folks to those schools, to sit down with those principals and watch more video, we've actually found it's really important to challenge them on their ratings of specific teachers that are in their building, that has a huge effect. We would steer more resources there. So I don't know exactly what choices you have before you, I'm sure that every one of you is struggling with fiscal scarcity right now. But I would be more inclined to skimp on upfront. And skimp isn't the right word. If in an ideal world we'd spend plenty of money on everything, but I would not feel comfortable with a risk where I was relying only on the LEAs after initial. I'm going to skip ahead past the integrated reliability slide that we already did and talk a bit about system capacity. This is something we get a lot of questions about. How do we think about outsourcing things? How do we think about the LEA role versus the SEA role? The most important leverage point in getting better evaluations is not the principals. I want to be clear about that. I think most people think it's the principals. It's not. It's the people who supervise them. It is the people who the principals report to. Sometimes in small districts, it's just the superintendent. In medium-sized districts, it's the assistant superintendent. It's network leaders. It could be anything. It is their job to cultivate the strong professional judgment in principals. And it is the presence of that professional judgment in principals that will make the evaluation system be good and stick over time. The way that they can do this is to give principals every reason to conduct strong, accurate evaluations and stepping into correct course when it doesn't happen. This is how you avoid at the state level having to be the cop over time. It's not going to work if the state capital is the center of gravity for everything for many reasons. But pressure or accountability that does not come from the principal's direct manager will have, we say substantially less, this is my editorial comment, it will have exponentially less power. They don't respond to the superintendent if the superintendent is not their manager. They do not respond to letters from the state. It really needs to be the person that works with that principal. And if those people are good, and if they want this to happen, and if they say to the principal, be honest with these folks, give good feedback, and I will back you, then that's how you'll get the furthest the fastest. I don't know what investments you have planned around that, but in terms of our work, we see that being a decade-long endeavor to find the right people who are going to be in those roles and to make sure they have good information to make good decisions. So the second bullet is building internal capacity at the district level is very important. Outside vendors can be useful in generating and disseminating data. I think that's one thing that outside partners are certainly well equipped to do. They can also generate supports, but without that focus on the principles as opposed to kind of building a foolproof system, I think we'll be back where we started. So I'm saying this as somebody who actually does partner with districts, so we're a vendor in that sense, but I would make sure that you don't confer too much hope on the outsiders to do things that can only be done by the folks that actually work with the schools every day. And sometimes we forget about the district administrators because we're so focused on the teachers and leaders themselves. So what I would urge you to do is to think about these folks that supervise the principals. Here's the one benefit. There's not that many of them. You probably have a lot of teachers in your state and a lot of principals, but I'll bet you the people that supervise principals are not so numerous that you couldn't make a meaningful impact on them if you that was the priority. And I think that was it for the slides. That's the last one. So I'll pause and Corinne, we can take a couple of questions if folks have them.
Yeah, that'd be great. We had some really good questions during the presentation. Does anyone have any follow-up questions for Tim? Tim, I think you did a great job with lessons learned. I'm looking through my question list, and I think you answered just about all of them. Anyone on the phone? Okay. Well, I think we're going to close this session out. We just hit about 40 minutes, and I appreciate everyone's questions and everyone's attention.